So the first homework was just write a function that implements something very simple, which is to repeat some amount of work and then call that function twice inside your main. So this was just to demonstrate that yes, you can write a function once and then use it multiple times, so you can have do some work. So let me make an empty project here. That. So the first function that I asked you to write was something called cheers, which is just, it's going to output the word cheers based on a number that's passed into it. So there's two parts to declaring the function, and then there's the calling part of it. So the first thing was, in this homework I asked you to use this prototype, so that is, the return type is void, and the name of the function is cheers, and it takes a single integer argument. So literally it's just doing exactly what I asked you to do for the prototype. Now remember, a prototype has no implementation, it just has a semicolon at the end of it. Then I asked you to write the function so that it outputs the word cheers this many times. So that means that I want to repeat this amount of work that many times. Before I get to that though, I just want to call this once, like so. I'm not even going to use this argument. I'm just going to call cheers. I'm going to say 5 and cheers 100. Okay. Notice that this function prototype here and the declaration, the actual implementation of the function down here, they match, with the exception of the argument name, which I also stress that I prefer to have the argument name in the prototype as well. It's optional to leave this out. It's not optional to leave this out. You can't do that. So in this function, I'm just doing one line, which is just to output it. When I call it though, the way I call it is just by calling the function name. I'm invoking the function via the name of it and then passing it whatever arguments it needs. If I don't pass in any arguments at all, it will give me an error and I won't be able to run it because it says, hey, this function doesn't take, look at the bottom here. And if I actually go to my errors list here, look at my errors on the bottom. My first error is too few arguments in function call. That means that I don't have enough arguments to pass into the function. I have two errors which are on the same line, which are identical. And this one is telling me, hey, it does not take 0 arguments, which means there is no function that takes no arguments. There's only a function that takes 1 argument. So I need to pass that in. So keep in mind those errors. Those errors will help you out, like the error window. And then I run this. You can see it only outputs it twice, once for each function I call, because I haven't actually had it do the work that I wanted it to. So I want to repeat this cout this many times. So I'm going to write a loop that does this. If you can't recall exactly how this for loop works, I highly recommend you guys going back and doing some practice on it. Inside the book, chapter 5. There is a big, nice section on while loops and for loops. So if you guys aren't comfortable enough with those yet, I recommend going to chapter 5 in the primer book and doing some more research on that, because we're going to be using loops a lot. Okay. So this thing just loops over however many times you pass in. This argument that I'm using inside the loop is the one that's passed into the function here. So whatever number I called, whatever number I pass in the argument, that is what the value of times is going to be when I invoke that function. Okay? So the first time I call it, it's going to output it 5 times. The second time I call it, it's going to output 100 times. I could do a little bit smaller than that. Maybe I just do like 2 and 5. And maybe what I'll do is like so. Just so I can separate out, hey, I'm calling cheers 2 times, and here I'm calling cheers 5 times. Okay. Questions on this function? Yeah. You were okay, you good. Okay. Does this make sense? Cheers is a return type of void, which means that it doesn't return back with it a value at all. This also means that I cannot do something like this. This is not a legal operation because cheers by itself doesn't represent a value. When I call that function and when it comes back after it's done with that function, it has no value associated with it, which means I'm trying to print out nothing here. So I can't do a cout. Just like I can't do this. I can't create a variable called like foobar equals this return value. Right? Because that cheers function is void. Okay? All right. Let's go to the next assignment. Number 2 was using cube, which is a new function that returns a double instead of returning void. I'm on this one right now. So all it does, it will return back the value of what you passed in multiplied by itself 3 times. So cube. So let's write that now. So I gave you a prototype. In the prototype I called it x. You can call x or value. I only really use single variable names for something that like is obvious, like for loops, for a single number that doesn't change. Loops is very common used for single character variable names. Here it's okay that it's a single variable name because this thing doesn't actually represent much. It represents a value which you can type in here. Either value or x here would be fine. I would err on the side of making variable names more descriptive and more verbose than making them trying to be recursive with them, because I think I value clarity over like spacing. Like this is a little bit too much. Like writing a variable name like that is a little bit too much, because like you have a function called cube. You're passing in a value. I think the expectation is that this is the value that's going to be cubed. So then I write the implementation down here. And then I'm going to use my return. This indicates the end of the function, and you are telling it what you're going to return with it as the result. This on the right, this expression on the right side of return represents what is returned to the person that called the function. So in number 2, call this function once and pass it to number 5. Print out the result as if it was calculating the cube volume of a cube. So I could say, hey, that's my line. I'm going to print out that the volume of the cube with a width of 5 is this cube function, passing it the argument of 5. Here I can use this function inside of a cout because it actually returns a value. Okay? It's 125. Yeah. Okay, so that's an example of a function that has a return value. I can use it as a value. Now I can also use this thing just by itself. What happens if I just do cube 5 by itself like this? So this is allowed. You can do this. But when I run this, nothing gets printed out, obviously, because I'm not printing it out. So that is the exception, is that even though this thing has a return value, you're not required to use it anywhere. You can actually just call that function and just ignore the return value if you want to. In this case, that wouldn't really make a lot of sense because it does work. and then tells you the result of that work in the return value. However, there are some cases where something does work and you don't actually care about the return value at all. One of the examples, for instance, is something like this, where it's like, hey, get list of game modes. And you have something that returns a bool, where remember, bool is just true or false. And this thing would return true if it succeeded or false if it failed, but it still returns, it still does some work. Let's say print list of game modes. I would just have a, I don't know, a loop that goes over some number of times. This is all fake code. But imagine that I would do a cout here. Return true, I don't know, if 65 is greater than 12. Let's just do that. This is a totally arbitrary example of like, hey, I failed for some reason, so I'm going to return false, or I'm going to return true. Regardless, I'm going to print out all the values here. So here's an example where I can call this function like that, and just by itself, and it'll still do work. So even though it has a return type, see, it's giving me an error because it does, I don't have a prototype for this up here. Even though I have a return type, I don't have to use that return type. Notice here, it's still doing a bunch of work. It's still printing out the numbers from 0 to 99. But look, I'm not using that return value anymore. However, I could use a return value like that if I wanted to. Notice the order it did this in. Look at where it printed the result is 0 here. 0 meaning it is false. It printed out after it did all the work for the function. Okay. I just want you guys to realize that when a function returns something, you have the choice of either calling it by itself or using it in a cout statement or using it in a variable. So you have those options. You don't have those options if the function returns void like Cheers does. Alright, so let me delete this. Let's go on to the next homework example. Alright, so I want to use the result of cube 4 and pass it into my Cheers function. So I'm going to take cube 4 and I'm going to call Cheers passing the result of cube 4. That's it. This will return me back 64, which will mean it'll print out the word Cheers 64 times. So I'm using the result of one function into the argument of another. Okay. All right. The last one was write a program that implements a function called ncars. And this is an example of a function that takes 2 arguments. And you write a loop that prints out that character that you pass in that many times. It's a lot like the Cheers function, however it takes an additional argument. So here's the prototype. The prototype here takes a single character as the first argument, and then a count of how many times you want to print it out. And you can use count or n. That's what the prototype looks like. I'm going to write the function. By the way, it doesn't matter the order that you declare them down here. The prototype order does matter a little bit here, depending on like where you're calling it relative to where it is in main. Like if you had a function down here, for instance, that wouldn't work. But for the most part, the order of function declaration doesn't really matter. So notice here I'm doing the ncars cube Cheers, but the prototype I'm doing the opposite order. That's fine. Here I'm going to write a for loop. And I'm going to call this function with the character W. I'm going to call it 50 times. Okay. It's very similar to cheers. It just is an example of something that takes 2 arguments instead. The bottom here. What happens if I do print out any character? What happens if I take this value and I just add 1 to it? I'm doing a C++ here. Look what it prints out on the bottom here. So characters, while they represent a letter or a number, they're actually just a number underneath. Watch what happens when I print out the character 0 followed by 255 times. The number 0. Did you guys hear a beep there?
Yes.
Yeah.
Just want to make sure that you guys heard the beep there. A beep is actually an example of one of the characters that you can print out, a system beep. So you guys are going to hear like 100 beeps here. This might be a little bit too much, but. But this is basically the ASCII table. Notice that there are some kind of interesting symbols here you can use to like the little gradient things here and the little rectangles here, but you also have the full alphabet and some accented characters. This is like a very classic version of like, hey, I have some symbols here. There's basically a representation of the alphabet plus some way to represent these like little border things they used to like do UI back in the old days. So like you would combine these in interesting ways to print them out so that they can make like brains and stuff. And you have smiley faces and card, like you have a spade and a heart and a diamond. It's a heart, diamond, club. There's a spade somewhere. So that's because I changed this function to do that, right? And I can change this function to do anything else, right? I can do it by 5. But that's the power of writing this function, is that even though I'm calling it 100 times, I can skip over a lot of them. So my character table is a lot smaller now. Okay, let's move on. Any questions on this?